Hello, and welcome to celloprofessor.com. This video goes with the article. It's all about the joints, the key to tension-free cello technique. And the point of this article is to emphasize the importance of knowing our pivot joints in cello technique and in the various motions we use when playing the cello. What do I mean by pivot joints? Well, for every motion that we do on the cello, or in everyday life actually, we have a pivot joint. For example, if I wave like this, we would say the pivot joint is the wrist. If I do this motion with my forearm, the pivot joint is the elbow. If I do this with my whole arm, the pivot joint is my shoulder. And with each pivot joint, it's important to realize that we have either an active motion or a passive motion. What do I mean by those? Well, let me give you an example with the hand wave. If I wave at you like this, we would call that an active motion in the hand. The wrist is the pivot joint. Now, how can I make this motion a passive motion? Well, if we move further up the arm and make the elbow a pivot joint and move the forearm like this, and then just let go of any muscle contraction in the forearm, I can get my hand to move passively. In other words, a passive motion is reactive to another active motion. The active motion is the forearm, and the passive motion would be in the hand. And we use both of those types of motions in cello technique. So it's important to identify the pivot joint, the active motion, and the passive motion. And often our motions on the cello have both passive and active motions. So we would need to identify those. And often motions on the cello have more than one pivot joint. Now, the reason I like to use the word pivot joint is because joints don't really move. Sometimes we'll say a joint motion, or we'll say move the wrist or something like that. It's not exactly accurate. Pivot joints rather serve as pivot points for other motions. I mean, if we didn't have any joints, we wouldn't be able to move at all, right? We would just be stiff. So joints are just pivot points. So, for example, this is the elbow moving. Well, not really. The elbow is the pivot point for an active motion here in the forearm, for example. Now, another important aspect to all of this that I have found in my teaching, primarily in my teaching, is that tension often shows itself around the pivot joints, inhibiting either a passive motion or an active motion. And as a result, often the student will opt for a different pivot joint, a different active motion, and one that is less efficient, simply because the more efficient motion has tension around that particular pivot joint. Let me give you an example. Some cellists, I have found some students, when I go to teach them the forearm motion, for up bows and down bows, if they have tension in the tricep and bicep, that's right by the pivot joint, this is not very free to move. And as a result, they might opt for a motion that comes from the shoulder instead, and so play continuously from the shoulder at all times, because maybe their shoulder's looser, the shoulder area is looser than the area around the elbow, so they prefer that. Or some cellists prefer to just move the forearm, because perhaps the muscles around that pivot joint, the elbow, are looser than the ones around the shoulder, so all they ever want to do is this. So it's important to also be able to practice the active motions and the passive motions off the cello, working on keeping the muscles around the pivot joints loose. Okay? And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about some of the ways we do up bows and down bows on the cello, and identify the pivot joint, the active motions, the passive motions, and then talk about how we can practice those. Okay? So let's first of all talk about the different ways we can do up bows and down bows. Let's identify those three areas: pivot joints, active motions, and passive motions. Okay, let's just talk about the bow stroke right at the frog. That is moderately slow to slow. That uses the entire arm. Okay? So as you can see, the pivot joint is the shoulder. You could say the active motion is the upper arm, right? You could even say the active motion is the whole arm, since it works like a unit. And if you want to analyze it down even further, you could say we have some passive motions in the hand and the fingers with pivot joints in the wrist and the knuckles. Okay? So all of those can be practiced. All of those can be practiced. Now, when we're doing these whole bows like this, what's very important that I've found in teaching this is the idea of momentum. Okay, we need to use momentum when we play the cello. We use it in so many other things, in sports. Can you imagine a tennis player not using momentum as they swing the tennis racket? Let's say they controlled the motion all the way through. Or the golfer, right, when they do the swing. Can you imagine them just holding it all the way through and not just letting momentum go? Or the basketball free throw. You get the motion started and you go, right? I have found that students with tension do not use momentum very well. Okay, and as I mentioned, that's usually because around the pivot joint there's tension in the muscles, is usually what happens. Okay, we need to use momentum. Okay, so we'll practice that when we get to the exercises. Let's go on now to another type of motion we can use on the cello for up bows and down bows. Okay, so here we have the elbow as a pivot joint, the forearm as the active motion, and then you could say we have, again, some passive motions in the hand and the fingers with pivot joints in the wrist and the knuckles. So I'm not actively moving these. These are merely reacting to the active motion in the forearm. Okay, so that would be another way to do up bows and down bows. And again, the idea of momentum is very important here when we're talking about the active motion. Just allowing the momentum to, or using momentum to your advantage. Okay, let's talk about another one. Let's talk about controlled spiccato. This one's a little harder to see, perhaps. But what we have is a swivel motion here in the shoulder socket. The nice thing about the shoulder, it's a ball and joint socket. It moves many different ways. And so when I do controlled spiccato, I think of this motion, like this. The upper arm swivels in the shoulder socket. So the pivot joint's the shoulder. The active motion is the upper arm, or you could say the whole arm, which is similar to the first one I showed you, but it's moving quite differently because this is a ball and socket joint and it can move many different ways. Okay? And we have, for the controlled spiccato, an active motion in the hand. The pivot joint is the wrist. Okay, so. And then there we have our controlled spiccato. Now, when you get into subtleties of articulation and so forth, you can start combining these motions. Like, for example, if I want a slightly longer spiccato, I could add this motion that I used for the whole arm motion at the frog, so that I would be doing a little of this swivel and a little of this one, and that gives my spiccato a little more length. But I believe in practicing the motions separately before you actually combine them. It's difficult to combine things if you can't do them separately, right? Okay, and let's talk about another way to do up bows and down bows. Let's talk about the sautelé stroke. Another spiccato stroke. There's a whole separate page on the website devoted just to this. For this exercise, I like to think of it as an active motion in the forearm, pivot joint in the elbow, with passive motion in the hand, with a pivot joint at the wrist. And this is the one that is difficult for a lot of students to get. You can get them to do the active motion in the forearm, but it's hard to get students to have the passive motion in the wrist. And that's what gives us delay stroke. Right? Okay. So there we have 4 different ways we can do up bows and down bows. How about the whole bow? Right? Now this combines a lot of different things together. Basically you start with this stroke, the one we did when we were at the frog, with the shoulders, the pivot joint, whole arm, active motion. And then as you come out to the tip, then you will use just the forearm as the active motion with the elbow as the pivot joint. So right about there, the forearm will take over. And the shorter the arm, the sooner that this last motion takes over from the whole arm motion. It goes like this. Okay? So takes over, and then the whole arm again. Okay? And on the website I go into more detail with a lot of these particular bow strokes too, as well. So there we have an analysis of the different ways we can use the right hand, and I'm just sticking with the right hand for the sake of this video, otherwise it would be really way too long. So let's now move on to the exercises for this. So I'm going to put my cello down and to stand up to do these. Okay, so let's practice our pivot joints, active motions, and passive motions with the various bow strokes I just showed you. The first one we did was with the shoulders, the pivot joint, active motion in the upper arm or the whole arm, like this. This is used for the lower half of the bow. And the way I practice that is the elephant trunk, or you can call it the grandfather clock, whatever you want. And again, use momentum. Momentum is so important when we play the cello. They use it in sports, right? When you do a free throw, you get it started, and there's a follow-through, which is momentum. Same in golf, tennis, pitching a baseball. Right? You use momentum in all of those motions if you play those sports. Or if you don't, think about walking. We use momentum when we walk. We don't control the muscles through the whole course of the action. We get them started and we kind of let them go. And we need to do the same thing on the cello. For some reason we get behind the cello and we don't want to use momentum anymore. We want to get all tight. Okay? So, so here's the grandfather clock. And then what I do is I gradually bend at my elbow, like this. Okay, and now I call this the swing, because it's like you could have 2 people sitting on your forearm there. Now some students like to do this. That is an indication that there's tension in the shoulder, and therefore that tension results in immobility to do this. And so they'll substitute something else. So watch for that. And remember, don't let it go this way, by the way, either. Sometimes it'll start to go backwards when you do the grandfather clock, like you're walking. We want to go left to right, and remember to keep the hand loose. I wouldn't keep the hand up like that. To me, that just is a sign of tension here. Just shake it out if you need to, and then go like this. And then try it with the pencil in the hand. It feels quite different when you do that. It adds a little extra tension to the arm. Okay, so this is lower half of the bow, low elbow, shoulders, pivot joint, active motion, whole arm. And then we have pivot joints in the wrist and the knuckles with passive motions here. That's just an indication that the hand is loose then. Okay, now let's try the forearm motion here. Now we use this one when we want to do fast passages and we don't want to move our whole arm, because this is a lot of mass to move quickly. So we can just move part of our arm. Now the elbow only moves in 2 directions. So that's unlike the ball and socket joint of the shoulder. If my elbow's low, I'm going to go floor, ceiling, floor, ceiling. So I'm going to need to have my elbow up so that I can actually go left to right. We can debate about low elbow, high elbow, but if you want to use your forearm, you need to have the elbow up. Okay, and again, use momentum. Okay, so we have the elbow as the pivot joint, right? We have an active motion in the forearm, and then passive motions again in the hand and the fingers with pivot joints all down in here, starting with the wrist and down through the knuckles. So I suggest letting the hand go and practice momentum. If it's tight, get it started and let it go. And then put the pencil in the hand and go like this. And then there's our forearm motion. Okay? Okay, the next one was spiccato. And that's the shoulders, the pivot joint, and we have the upper arm as the active motion. Or you could say the whole arm, because it should work as a unit. Okay? This is the the first one to get when you're doing the spiccato, and then to that you'll add an active motion in the hand with a pivot joint in the wrist. So you can practice that one. Do them separately, and then combine them, and then you'll make a V with the, or you could think of it as an arc that goes this way. And you combine both of those together, and that will give you the controlled spiccato. Okay, so, but you need to get this one down. Now, if this is trouble, sometimes I'll roll up like a little towel and just put it under the student's arm and have them go like that. And that can help as well. Okay, and then practice that with the pencil. Do this one, that one, and then you have your arc or your V. And always working on momentum with all of these motions. All of the active motions should use momentum. Okay, and then I talked quickly about the sautelé stroke, the fast spiccato. So that's, again, elbow is the pivot joint, forearm active motion, and the key here is to have passive motion in the hand with the wrist as the pivot joint. And your elbow's going to be a little bit lower for this. In fact, you'll be going at a 45-degree angle to the floor. That gives you some vertical and some horizontal, if that's what we need. And I encourage you to look under Advanced Right Hand Technique, under sautelé, and I go into a lot more detail there. So the first thing you do is you practice this, then loosen up and let the hand go, and then put the pencil in the hand and practice that. So this is passive motion here in the hand, wrist pivot joint, active motion forearm, pivot joint, elbow. So really, this stroke actually originates with the bicep and the tricep, because that's what's going to move your forearm in its active motion. And then we have the whole bow. I like to transition with a low elbow to a high elbow. That's how I do it. Okay, so the first thing I like to do is practice the chicken wing. This gives you the feeling of raising and lowering your elbow. And I like to practice door and a hinge. And then I'll do elbow, or the chicken wing. And I'll do door and a hinge. So the chicken wing obviously is using the shoulder as the pivot joint, active motion upper arm. And then I start combining them like this. Now you have wing on a hinge. There you go. I also call this the basketball pass. Okay, so that gives you a transition from a lower elbow to a higher elbow and back down. That's how I like to do the whole bows. So you may have some different ways of doing technique. If you're a cellist or a cello teacher, we all have different schoolings and different ways of doing things. But hopefully with this article and this video, it can help all of us analyze a little more carefully how we do these motions on the cello and identify those pivot joints and active and passive motions. And they can be helpful for students and for us to understand exactly how we're using our bodies. So thank you.